Hey everybody, you are listening to Renewalcast, a weekly podcast that features interviews, discussions, and teaching on various biblical and theological subjects. And we do this because we believe that our minds are to be shaped and renewed by the life-giving and transforming Word of God through the power of the Holy Spirit. So we pray that for the next few minutes as you listen, you will see Jesus more clearly. Today on the podcast, we have Dr. James Dolezal, and he has been on the podcast before talking about classical theism and divine simplicity. And now we're going to talk about Christology. And in part one here, we're going to talk about Christological heresies. And then in part two, next time, we're going to talk about how to correctly talk about those things. Now, we did have some technical difficulties, so today's episode does kind of just abruptly end. But I think you'll get the point and you'll enjoy this conversation with Dr. Dolezal. So thank you for listening. Enjoy the conversation. Hey everybody, welcome to Renewalcast. Today we have a guest with us. Dr. James Dolezal is on with us today. He's been on a couple times before, really one time, but we divided it up. So third appearance on the podcast today. Last time we talked about divine simplicity, and we talked about having you come on and talking about Christology. So that's the subject today. Such an important conversation in our day, and a subject that we just need to think through properly. And we just want to thank you for coming on and helping us think through this important doctrine. Maybe just start by telling us a little bit about yourself, about your family. Just kind of reintroduce yourself to us a little bit. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in your life.
Sure. Well, thank you again for having me back. Really glad to be here and look forward to our conversation. I am currently a professor of theology at Radius Theological Institute in Bakersfield, California, and then also teach in the School of Divinity at Cairn University in Langhorne, Pennsylvania. Prior to my current post in Bakersfield, I had been in residence at Cairn for 9 years teaching, and gratefully been able to continue teaching for them even now from a distance. And so those are that's my day job, so to speak. Married, 3 children, and we are and thrilled to be here talking about an Orthodox Christian Christology. So thank you to all 3 of you for having me back.
So let's just start. What is Christology? When we talk about that, what do we mean?
Most broadly, when we say Christology, the study of Christ, the Lord's anointed, in the broader sense, that encompasses the person and work of Christ. And so God the Son, come in the flesh, born of a virgin, obeying unto death, suffering on the cross, rising, ascending, currently in session at the right hand of God, returning. That's the broad umbrella of Christology. More narrowly and properly, sort of Christology proper, if we can think about it that way, is really a study of the person of Christ with respect to his incarnation. And so in the more narrow sense, Christology is the identity of Christ in his person with respect to his 2 natures. And most of the discussion in Christology centers around proper articulation of the unity of the person, the distinction of the natures, and then the operations of the person given that unity of natures. So maybe that's a kind of a clunky classroom way of putting it, but that's basically what Christology studies. And you'll see, in a lot of seminaries, you'll have a semester on the person of Christ, and then you'll have a semester on the work of Christ, or something like redemption accomplished. And sometimes the work of Christ historically falls more properly as the first part of soteriology. So when we talk about the work of Christ, we're talking about the work of Christ as prophet, priest, and king come to save. And so it kind of falls within the manner of redemption's accomplishment, whereas Christology proper is the person and his relation to his natures and their relation to each other, and how to navigate that in a sound, biblical way. And what gives you a lot of things to say is that there are just so many Christological heresies that it allows that discussion to sort of grow as the centuries pass.
Yeah, one of my fondest memories of Theology 1 is going through the Christological heresies and just being overwhelmed, not knowing how to talk about these things. Because it seemed like every time I wrote something in a paper or something like that, I'm just was, okay, am I falling into one of these traps? And
Thomas Weinandy says in one of his books on Christology that, I think it's his book, Does God Change?, which is a 1985 book on the incarnation and whether the incarnation compromises divine immutability. That's the basic thrust of the book's focus. And I think it's in there that he says that the Christian faith is marked by three profound and mysterious unions that lie at the heart of it. The union of the three persons in one nature, that union of the Trinity, that profound unity of nature subsisting in three persons. The union of the believer to Christ, in which it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And then he says the third mysterious union that lies at the heart of our faith is that of the divine and human nature in the person of the Son. So the hypostatic union, Trinitarian union, salvific union with Christ, and then the union of the two natures. And he says, and Weinandy's done a good bit of work on the Trinity and Christology, and he says that for his money, the unity of the two natures in the one person is in fact the most difficult to articulate, because in one respect, it requires that you be already very good on the doctrine of the Trinity. So to have a good Christology, you actually have to have a good anthropology to make sure that you don't hollow out the humanity of something essential to it. So you have to have a good understanding of man. If the Word became flesh or the Word became human, reasonable soul and body, then you're going to have to actually understand a fair bit about a reasonable soul and body to make sure that you don't undermine it when you attribute it to the Son. But then you're also going to have to be equally good on the doctrine of God, or sound. When I say good, I mean sound, on the doctrine of God, so that you don't compromise the doctrine of God either when you articulate, for instance, John 1:14, and so the Word became flesh. And so Weinandy's point is articulating the union of the two natures in the person. There's so much theological preconditioning foundation that needs to be laid well just to get to that next level. And so if you're off on your anthropology or you're off on your doctrine of the divine nature, then almost inevitably that's going to show up in your Christology too. And this might be, just to hazard a guess, this might be the reason that among sort of classical textbook heresies, there are so many more Christological ones than any other kind. But maybe that's rambling a bit, but it at least presents the challenge of doing Christian Christology.
No, I think that's a good way to put it. I think that's a good setup when we start talking about, Christ taking on flesh. What are the options there for understanding that?
And so I take it when you mean options, I don't think you mean a smorgasbord of legitimate different
Right.
options.
No.
I'm assuming for our listeners anyway.
Right.
I'll assume that.
How are we to understand this?
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, that's good. And there are all sorts, and to the point, maybe to Cole's point, there are all sorts of options intellectually available that aren't biblically available. In other words, there are ways of conceiving unity. In fact, there are many ways of conceiving unity that turn out to be ungrounded and problematic when it comes to what the scriptures require us to say about Christ Jesus. And so, I don't know, as you think about it, one way to do this is just by kind of an archaeology of heresies and look at some, because let me frame this. Here's what I think we should do. Let me frame this broadly and then kind of narrow in. I think the temptation when you say the Word became flesh or God became man, if you want to say that, the temptation of that every heresy has in common, every false way of putting that together has in common, is the assumption that you cannot have the union of divinity and humanity in the person without something giving way. And I like to phrase this kind of in a crass way as a Christology of something's got to give. So if you start with the assumption that I can't get to this union, the word made flesh, without making some modifications on one side or the other, or in the unity of the person. That is to say, something's got to give. Either true divinity has got to be dialed down or suspended or pushed. You push pause on it. Something's got to give. Divine operations got to give. Divine attributes have to give. Divine attributes have to stop doing things. I mean, however you need it. So on the one side, what's got to give? Maybe divine immutability's got to give. Maybe divine timelessness has got to give. Maybe divine simplicity's got to give. Something, or maybe divine operations, like upholding the worlds by the word of his power, have to give in order for him to become weak, even unto death. So on the one side, something's got to give. One kind of set of heresies says, and that something is something in either the divine nature or divine operation. That's got to give. Or on the other side, and this is actually proposed first, that something in the humanities got to give. And so, one heresy would say he wasn't really flesh because a material part is too low and crass and unworthy for a divine person. Therefore, docetism or dakeo, to seem. So real flesh is given up. Or maybe it's real flesh, but it's not a real soul. And so you give up the soul. And so something's got to give, either the flesh of the humanity or the soul of the humanity, or something normal, not sinful about the humanity has got to be kind of modified or massaged out of the equation in order to pull off the union. So something's got to give on the divine side. Something's got to give maybe on the human side. Some theologies will actually compromise and say a little bit on each side, but maybe more on the human side. Those are what I call, and then there's a third kind of problem, which is to say nothing has to give with regard to the natures. The natures are not in any way tinkered with or modified or obfuscated or suspended or whatever you want to say. Rather, the unity of the person is. And so there's not really a sameness, numerical sameness of personhood. This is what you get in Nestorianism. Rather, there are two persons who are so closely collaborating that they appear as one face or one prosopon, which is a Greek word that we sometimes translate person. So they're one person in appearance, even though below that singular appearance, they really are two persons. And so what's got to give in that case? You don't give up your divine, you don't give up your doctrine of God, you don't give up your doctrine of man, you give up the doctrine of the unity of the person. And if I can, I don't want to be oversimplifying about this, but I would argue, and I'm willing to be corrected, but I would at least propose that every Christological heresy is due to the assumption that you cannot pull off the incarnation without something giving. True humanity, true divinity, unity of person. And what you'll find in every historical heresy is that they're compromising one of those things to, as it were, pull it off. And it's only orthodoxy that says the word became flesh and nothing gave, so to speak. Nothing was, in fact, modified, altered, suspended in either nature or in the unity of the person. And I would submit that feeble and human as it is, attempts like the definition of the Council of Chalcedon, 551, without dissolving the mystery, effectively and adequately pull that off. And I mean, pull it off. What I mean is say everything that needs to be said without compromise. So that's kind of my broad template. My template is a Christology of nothing's got to give and a Christology of something's got to give. Orthodoxy on one side, all varieties of heresy competing with each other for the something's got to give on the other side.
That's good and helpful, I think. I have a question. We have a group in our area that's docetic in their Christology. I believe they would, in their doctrine, would say that they call Jesus' flesh a celestial flesh, a product of heaven. He did not get his humanity from Mary. It is something of a flesh, but it came from heaven. Kind of like Menno Simmons.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I asked somebody, I think the Mennonites don't believe that anymore, but they did. And so all the early Reformed will castigate the Anabaptists, and particularly the Mennonites, as Christological heretics because they believe that the material component was not itself drawn from Mary. And I think it was the Valentinians that were the older version of that. So the Mennonites were the Reformational era Valentinians who argue that he did not share in a common flesh with us because Mary was just like a channel through which this celestial flesh just kind of passed through, more of like a pipe or conduit, but there was no material contribution to to the material part of Christ's humanity from Mary.
And so some of them are saying, well, that's not a big deal, you know. How would you answer that, being a professor of Christology? How would you come back? How would you answer that?
I think the difficulty with that is then that Christ is not of our species. Christ is not a human in the adequately sufficient human way that we are human. And there's a certain a very definite organic unity with those that he came to save that is necessarily forfeited by that doctrine. And it also, I think it also raises problems for Mary being his mother, really. I mean, I guess if you want to say surrogacy, something like that. But even in modern surrogacy, there's material contribution being made to the development of that child, even from a surrogate mother. I mean, so really, Mary isn't even a surrogate mother in that theology. So I think it raises problems for the identity of Mary more maximally for the identity of Christ and his unity with us in our nature. He is not in any real human way our brother, and that's how Scripture describes him as our. He calls us his brethren, and that is not just metaphorical language for like my brothers, people I like to hang out with. I think that's really, according to our nature, he is one of us in that relevant, natural sense, even organically and familially. So I think that there's a unity as one of us, made like unto us, that is forfeited in the Valentinian Menno Simons celestial flesh. Beside the fact, John, I mean, even beside, that's more like contemplative stuff. I would also just say, and also the Bible doesn't say that. So that would be my other argument, which might be the one I should have started with. So
thank you.
Yeah,
that's
I think
helpful.
it has problems on several levels. Catholics would probably start with Mary. That means Mary isn't the mother of God. Which, you know what? I'll be honest. I do believe that the Theotokos is an orthodox way of speaking about Mary. And so I sympathize with that concern, though that's like number 2 or 3 on my list. So do you want to talk about some of the specific gotta give heresies? Because I thought we were going to do that as well. Just like, because they don't all agree with each other on like on like what's got to give. So, and they're pretty interesting because these heresies were really the occasion of Orthodox Christianity sort of sharpening its expression. So I think they're worth mentioning because they're still around. I mean, all these heresies don't really die. They just, new ones are spawned and the old ones still stick around. And it'd be nice to think we buried heresies, but you tend to multiply them in like zombies. They just continue.
Teach us.
I think the interesting one, the easiest one to go to, I guess, first, before Arianism. I mean, Arianism looms large in our minds because Arianism actually was the occasion of the first truly ecumenical council of the church. But long before Arianism, you had several kind of lesser known boutique Christological heresies, like an angel Christology that argued that he wasn't truly divine in nature. He was only divine-like, and Jesus was really just an angel looking like a man. You have angel Christologies. You have Docetism or Docetism, some will say, which is to say that he didn't really have flesh, he only appeared to, and so the flesh was really apparitional, more like a hologram. And that would be one. In other words, that kind of aligned with Gnosticism, which had a real distaste for flesh. Everything material, kind of, I'm being very generic here, but everything material, kind of distasteful, bad, and low. And therefore, he's truly divine, but there's no way he could be truly joined to flesh because flesh. You know what I mean? The flesh is gross. So you have, I'm simplifying, but that you have Docetism on that side. You also have forms like Ebionitism, forms of adoptionism on the other side, where Jesus really is a true man, but he doesn't actually subsist in the divine. His person doesn't subsist in the divine nature. He's only called Son of God honorifically. And then the adoptionists debate among themselves at which point in the career of the man Jesus, son of Mary, at which point in his career the adoption was effected. And so some will say he was adopted immediately upon his conception in the virgin's womb. Others will say that the man was adopted at baptism. So This is my beloved son, whom I'm well pleased, is not a statement in any way about this son having a divine nature. This is just an honorific title given to a great man who is the greatest prophet and even therefore Messiah. So, like, even before you get into ecumenical councils, sort of settling some of these issues for us, you already have these are just tastes. You have samplings. There's a book, and now I'm Papandraka, I think, or something along those lines, has a book called Five Christological Heresies, and it just studies Christological heresies before the big ones came on later. And I would recommend the book just as a great little introduction to early Christological heresies. But each of those is a something's got to give. True humanity, the material part, is giving and docetism. True divinity is giving and adoptionism. And so both of those are just variations on a theme of something's got to give. Valentinianism, I think, is prior to Arianism, because Arius, in fact, disavows Valentinianism. Arius, the heretic, disavows Valentinianism. This is actually, by the way, why Christological heresies can be confusing, because the Christological heretics themselves, are in mortal combat with each other. They don't have to, Docetism and Ebionitism are sworn enemies of each other. But they share a common fallacy, which is something's got to give in order for this incarnation thing or this Christology thing to work. So they have a baseline commonality, though they sharply disagree on what's got to give. Valentinianism, what's got to give is the sameness of flesh with us, that he is not of our flesh, and that he is not of his brethren. They're not his brethren according to the flesh. It also, to John, to your earlier point, also raises questions with regard to his genealogy. How could he be of the tribe of Judah if he doesn't share in the lineage of Judah? Now, I can imagine an adoptionist coming in and saying, well, he had celestial flesh, but he got the privilege of adoption. So now you have a weird adoptionism on the other side. Rather than the divine adopting man, it's actually a celestial flesh getting adopted into a human tribe. You go, all right, you're seeing how, this, by the way, this is why Christology is 9 heresies to 1 are Christological in character. All right, so because of these things. But Valentinianism says something's got to give. True human flesh drawn from the virgin's got to give. All right, so then go to Arius. Arius is, in so many ways, one of the arch heretics. I say one of because the Sabellians before him were also heretics on Trinitarian issues. And on Christology issues, interestingly. But Arius says that he's not true divine. But he's divine-like. Arius thinks the Son is not co-eternal with the Father, and so he is not co-unoriginate, and he has all sorts of things he says the Son is not. And so Arianism turns out to be that the Son is really the greatest creature. Now, you'll say, well, Arius, how does he create all things? And he'll say, well, then the Son creates everything after he's created, basically. So the Father creates the Son, and then the Son is actually the immediate creator of everything else, which is interesting. In the Nicene Creed, we say, I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. That also is anti-Arian, because the Arians believe that the creator of heaven and earth was actually the Son, and the Father only created the Son, and that's it. And so they actually denied universal immediate creatorhood to the Father. So the Nicene Creed is anti-Arian in more ways than we tend to suspect, but that's one of them. So anyway, that's what we're more familiar with. We're used to Arius's doctrine that what's got to give? True, unalloyed, unoriginate divinity in the Son's got to give. But Arius is actually more complicated than that. For our listeners, early first half of the 4th century, early 300s, if you're trying to locate Arius, and Alexandria, Egypt, if you want a location. This is where he's a presbyter. But Arius, of course, has a doctrine of the incarnation. He believes that the Word was made flesh and that he took a lower nature into union with his higher nature. But in Arius, this is actually the union of 2 created natures, a human one and a non-human created one, which is his original nature. Do you have this? So Arius, when he comes to the incarnation, is actually uniting 2 created natures, one of them higher, one of them lower. And the higher one is an intellectual one. The created Son is an intellectual creature of unparalleled glory for Arius. And when that creature of unparalleled created glory becomes flesh, becomes man, what does he take to himself when he takes humanity to himself? He does not. Arius argues that he does not take to himself a reasonable human soul, but that he only takes to himself the material part. And after all, doesn't John 1:14 say the word became flesh? Are you good on this? So what's got to give in Arianism? It's a compromise. Something gives on both sides. True and full uncreated divinity has to give, but also true humanity as a composite of body and soul has to give. And the only thing from humanity that the Son takes to himself is the flesh. And what substitutes for the human soul in Jesus, according to Arius, is his lowercase d divinity. That is to say, his created, divine-like, intellectual nature substitutes for a human soul, so that we already have an intellectual being here. Why do we need to complicate things by giving him another mind and another immaterial part? We've already got enough created immateriality here to pull off humanity. We don't need to bother with assuming a full and complete human nature. Like, that's Arius. And I think we lose sight of this. In the 4th century, what was so scandalous about Arius' theology was not simply his denial of the Son's true divinity, it was also his denial of the Son's true and complete humanity. And so for Arius, like, this is why he's such a fantastic heretic. He's got something giving on both sides. Okay, does that kind of set the scene? And then to the third great, and it gets dealt with at a council, is Apollinaris. Apollinaris is a friend of Athanasius, but then later really veers away from Athanasius and falls foul of the Cappadocian fathers. But Apollinaris basically takes that human side. He denies Arius's denial of the full divinity of the Son. He believes in the full, uncreated, co-eternal, homoousios in terms of divine nature. Apollinaris believes all of that. But he agrees with Arius that the Son doesn't have a human soul. When it's kind of objected that the human soul actually accounts for certain configurations in, like, the human body, and the soul actually there are sensitive powers that are given with the soul, not only intellectual. It seems, again, the evidence is scant. It seems like Apollinaris says, okay, maybe he has a soul, but no different than the animals do. And I know, like, most of us think animals don't have a soul, but the Bible talks about the souls of animals. And by the way, the word animos means soul. So there's that. I'll just leave that to the side. What kind of soul, though? Not a rational soul, not a reasonable soul. We say in our tradition, reasonable soul to distinguish from unreasonable soul. So in Greek thought, a soul is an immaterial principle of life in a living material thing. So there are the souls of plants, that is to say, the material that makes them living entities, that we call a vegetative soul. There are souls of animals, a motive soul that can operate according to sense appetite. We might call that an animal or sensible soul. And then there's a rational or an intellectual soul. This is unique to humans, and this is the highest form of soul. And it includes both the vegetative aspects, that is to say, living things that can live by metabolizing other things, okay, eating stuff. And there's also the animal appetite, sense appetite, ability to move ourselves. So the animal aspects are included in the soul. And it seems like Apollinaris concedes that perhaps the kind of soul that was assumed by the Son was like the animal sort, able to account for the vegetative and sensible aspects of the Son. Being thirsty, I'm hungry, do you have anything to eat? What accounts for that? Well, he's got at least that lower level soul to account for it. But what Apollinaris won't allow is that he has an immaterial intellectual soul. That's the one that he said, the intellectuality of the human soul is what he denies. The argument against him is, but that's the thing that distinguishes us from all the animals. Aristotle would say we're a rational animal. The rationality is actually the thing that differentiates us. And that's the very thing that locates us in our species as humans, is the very thing Apollinaris is denying the Son has. The divine mind of the Son does all the intellectual work of the man Christ Jesus. So there is no reasonable soul. And so later Christian tradition will say, you'll find this in a lot of Reformed confessions, that Christ took to himself a reasonable soul and body. Why not just say soul and body? Because Apollinaris could actually grant that he took to himself a soul and body, but not a reasonable one, in which case it wouldn't be adequately human. And so we say reasonable soul and body. So what gives an Apollinarianism? Either the soul in its grosser form or at least the intellectual higher aspect of the soul is what's got to give. And so the complaint is, but that's not true humanity. I don't know. Does that make sense? Like so he doesn't really assume to himself a human nature, and he's not really a man, because you're only a man if you have an intellectual soul. So I don't know. That's one heresy that raises concerns, and he's emphatically condemned by the First Council of Constantinople in 381. So that's on the one side. And I mean, the kind of cheeky way of saying it is this is sort of God in a bod Christology. Sort of, there's no soul to see here, just a body, and then it's a union of divinity and body. And after all, doesn't John say the word became flesh? It doesn't say the word became reasonable soul, although the New Testament furnishes us with ample reason to believe that he assumed a reasonable soul. And then the Orthodox will say, well, it points to the flesh because the flesh is the lower part of our nature, and it's making the point about how complete the incarnation is. It wasn't just the higher part of our nature that he took to himself. It was the higher part together with that lower animal part. He became man, body, and soul. So body is kind of emphasized to show how complete was this incarnation, really. But that raises a problem. Like, I think Pope Damasus in the West and maybe Gregory, now I'm trying to think, maybe Nazianzus in the East, both had a similar response, which went something like this: that which is not assumed is not healed. That which is not assumed is not healed. And so if he doesn't take to himself a human soul, then he cannot perform the requisite remedy in the soul. And after all, isn't the soul really the locus of our spiritual disease? Isn't the soul what we need to have cured? And so if Christ does not take to himself a human soul, or at least a reasonable soul, then the reasonable soul, which is in fact the very locus of our sinfulness, because that's where our will is, and will is sin's showplace, then Christ is not sufficiently human to, as it were, set the record right with humanity. So that which is not assumed is not healed. But that's one end of the pendulum. What's got to give? True humanity. But the pendulum then swings like within a generation or two, almost to the opposite end of the spectrum with Nestorius, in which Nestorius like famously creates trouble for himself on a Christmas Day sermon in Constantinople. Now we're talking about late 300s, early 400s, Istanbul, for those who are looking at a modern map. And he preaches a Christmas sermon, in which he denies that Mary is Theotokos, which is to say the God bearer, or we might say Mary, Mother of God. She's not the God bearer. She's the Christotokos, he says, the Christ bearer, but not the God bearer, because God doesn't have a mother, and so therefore Mary's not the mother of God. But Theotokos was actually being commonly attributed to Mary in the East and the West for quite a while before this. Then immediately raised questions. Well, who do you think Jesus is then? Mary birthed Jesus, Mary bore Jesus, and Jesus is God. But if you say Mary didn't bear God, do you really believe Jesus is God? You know what I mean? Like it's getting to the question of who. Who was in Mary's womb, if not God the Son? And then if Mary bore him, then who Mary bore is none other than the eternal Son of God. And who is God? The Word in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And so who did Mary bear? And it raises questions for Nestorius, and many argue that Nestorius probably was not theologically or intellectually sort of ready for the firestorm that came his way in response to his sermon. Cyril of Alexandria, most famously, but others as well, opposed Nestorius. And what Nestorianism basically, and I say basically meaning it gets a little bit more elaborate than this, came down to was that he argued that there was one prosopa, one face of Christ. So we could talk about one Lord Jesus Christ, because that's what the Nicene Creed said, in the sense of there's one sort of presentation. But in terms of who, if I can put it like that, there were two who's, so to speak: Mary's Son and God the Son. And that these were in fact distinct sons, and who they were is not identical. But also, in terms of being Christ, he takes Christ as a name for a prosopon, a face. There was one face of Christ, but there were two natures and two persons, or two who's, who had those natures, collaborating in a almost indistinguishable unity as the Christ. So he'll say, I believe in one Christ, not two. But for him, Christ is a face put on a collaboration between two distinct persons. And he's condemned at the Council of Ephesus and then again at the Council of Constantinople. And he's raked over the coals mercilessly by Cyril of Alexandria, arguing for the unity of Christ's person. So for Nestorius, divinity doesn't give, so to speak, and humanity doesn't give. The unity of the person gives. There isn't really one who is the Lord Jesus Christ. There are two who together are the one Christ in terms of presentation. So does that make sense? I mean, so this is a third way to give. You can give divinity, you can give humanity, or you can keep both of those and give up unity of person. Like so in terms of concretely how it shook out in church history, these are some of the ways. Maybe the third one I want to mention two more, and then we can turn the page, so to speak. Eutyches is now I'm trying to remember if he's a deacon or a presbyter in the church in Constantinople, and he proposes in the late 540s that in fact there is only one person, but it's not only one person, but it's one person from two natures, but now in one nature. And we call this monophysitism. Physis means nature, mono, one. And so monophysitism is actually the argument that in the incarnation, what you have is something like a fusion of two natures into one, and it's like a third thing. It's a tertium quid. It's one nature that is in fact developing out of two that are melding into as it were, a third thing. And Eutyches is sometimes it's called Eutychianism, but more broadly, because there are other versions of it, monophysitism. And what gives here is arguably both divinity and humanity give into a third nature that is neither true God nor true man, but kind of a hybrid, and I'll say it really quickly because I don't know how else to say it audibly, a God-man thing. He's a God-man thing. And the God-man, not true God, true man, but from true divinity and from true humanity are fused this singular nature, monophysite, the God-man thing. And as it turns out for Eutyches, it's like, I mean, not that he gives it this way, but it's like 99 parts divinity to 1 part humanity. And I think he'll use language like, there's a drop of humanity. In the incarnation, what happens is a drop of humanity is dropped into the ocean of divinity, which is, it's like in the way it, like practically the way it sounds is very nearly Docetist. You know what I mean? Like the divine almost so, like if you thought of a drop of vinegar in the ocean, just kind of almost dissolve, but still there's a mixture there. That's neither pure vinegar nor pure water at that point. It's a mixture of the two, even if the mixtures are not in equal parts. So he's not saying 50% God, 50% man, and now there's a new third thing of equal proportions. Eutyches is definitely saying the divine portion vastly overwhelms the human portion. But nevertheless, it's a nature, Christ is not in two natures. He's a new nature from two natures. And as far as the early church goes, that's kind of your range of big Christological heretical options that are all trying to correct a perceived error in the other, but all of them share in this kind of fundamental something's got to give. Unity of person, integrity of the two natures, and it turns out that there are all sorts of ways in which you can kind of put that together in a problematic sense. So, and I want to add one other one. I think in modern times, canonicism does this. And canonicism is tricky because the word kanao, or kenosis, comes from Philippians 2:7, and the word, that God, he was in the form of God, but he emptied himself and became flesh. And kanao is the idea of emptied or made himself of no account, might be the sense of it. That's how the King James renders it, and I think that's conceptually accurate. But canonicism says that the word that he who was in the form of God became form of the servant, morpho doulou, by basically either the more gross forms, totally giving up his divinity and just saying, I love them so much and I want to save them, I'm willing to just quit being God. And somehow the person survives that loss. That is an extreme, radical kind of canonicism that most canonicists roundly repudiate. So where do you go from there? The argument was something like this. God is omnipresent. God is omnipotent. God is omniscient. Jesus is not omnipresent. Like when he's in Galilee, he's not in Judea or the Decapolis, although I guess somewhat the Decapolis is right up by Galilee. But if he's here, he's not there. He seems to not fill heaven and earth, because he's sitting here with us at the Sea of Galilee having fish. So it would seem that Christ incarnate is not omnipresent. And so in order for him to be local, like on the cross as opposed to in the upper room, doesn't it seem like we're going to have to pull that off? Doesn't it seem like we're going to have to forfeit omnipresence? Because omnipresence and local presence just seem to not be able to cohere in the same person at the same time. The second one would be divine omnipotence, inasmuch as he suffered unto death and was even made weak for us. I mean, how weak? Mortal weak, because he really died. It seems like immortality and power are the sorts of things that can't actually cohere with mortality and weakness. And therefore, omnipotence must be foregone. And then they debate amongst each other whether it was only foregone for 33 years or whether it was a permanent divestiture. The canonicists they fight with each other over that. But we know this. If Jesus was ever weak unto death, then he could not be the one who upholds all things by the word of his power. And they have proposals like if Jesus upholds all things by the word of his power, but then he had to give up power in order to become man so he could be weak unto death, then who was upholding all things? And some canonicists will propose things like he just handed it off to the Spirit. So not to be I want to make this look ridiculous because this is ridiculous and it deserves to look ridiculous, but it looks something like this. Hey, I've got to go be weak now. So watch over the world for me for a while. Be back in 33 years. Or it's all yours from here on out, if it's a permanent divestiture. Something like that. Whereas Orthodoxy says that the very one who suffers unto death upholds by the word of his power all things, including the very gibbet on which he is affixed by nails. The nails exist by his power making them be. At the very moment that in his humanity, they hold him to that cross. The wood of the cross is sustained and made to be by the one who upholds all things by the word of his power. But if he's dying and succumbing, then how can he be the one who's also making all things be and upholding them? And Orthodoxy says we must affirm both. We must say nothing's got to give. We want to say unity of person, operation and integrity of both natures without compromise. So we'll come to that maybe in a second. And then the other kind of a more softer version of canonicism says that he doesn't get. Oh, by the way, an omniscience. No man knows the day or the hour. The Son, neither the Son or the angels in heaven. And since the Son locates some non-knowledge in himself, obviously you can't not know and be omniscient at the same time. And so omniscience has got to be at least temporarily shelved or suspended so that the Son can come down and not know things for a while. That would be so 19th century canonicism among German Lutherans originally, but it spread over into Anglicanism after that. And now I would argue it has spilled over much farther than that. And we find versions of it in kind of conservative evangelicalism. There's a softer version still, though, which is not a divestiture of attributes or even a putting off of attributes. It's actually much more modest, but I still think it's a form of canonicism, which is a cessation of operation. So instead of losing attributes or losing the divine nature, we just simply argue that there were certain divine operations that the Son was doing prior to the incarnation, that at the incarnation, the operations themselves were suspended.
Thanks for listening. You can find more information about us and check out past episodes on the website at renewalcast.com. Or you can connect with us on social media like facebook.com/renewalcast. We will see you again next week, Lord willing.